Very good day to you, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this webcast from the Chartered Body Alliance and hosted by the Chartered Banker Institute. I'm Bill McCall. In the Northern Hemisphere, autumn is upon us. For those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, the warmer days are coming, but for those in the North, winter is indeed coming, as they say. Now, in this discussion, we welcome three guests with a vast array of experience in their respective fields and beyond, and more about them in a moment. If you're watching us live, you can post your questions on the chat box, and I will try to bring those into the discussion as we go along. If we don't get to them, never fear, there is always a post-event chat and we can deal with it then. Now, if you're watching on catch up, well, you can't, as you probably have worked out. So you can't ask questions if it's post-event. Also remember, please, if you are a member of one of the Chartered Body Alliance groups, to log this as part of your continuing professional development log for the year. And those of you at Chartered Banker Institute know how to do that through the website, CISI similarly, and CII too. And if you are one of our Chartered Body Alliance colleagues, you're most welcome. And we thank you for your time today. Now, also online today, we have a PhD student, Candice Persad. And at the end of this broadcast, there will be a post-event survey. And we are hoping that those of you who know how difficult it is for PhD students to get real data from real operatives in the professions, there will be something from Candice to fill in later in the day. And I would urge all of you, please give a moment of your time to give some of your knowledge for the development of that PhD topic for her. That would be hugely appreciated by her and also by the Institute. Now on to our panel, patiently waiting there to talk. If any group of people can assist our thinking on the subject at hand, it is this collection of experts. Catherine Porter currently advises clients on the risk and opportunities of the energy transition, our subject matter today. Now, a master's in physics means she understands the science, and an MBA, the business end of things. She's a chartered fellow of the Chartered Body Alliance Partners at CISI, and Catherine has worked for a number of blue chip institutions, names that you will recognize from the CV that we have online. She's also a council member for the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Energy Studies in Westminster, and we are delighted she joins us from the CISI office today. Dr. Arthur Niemczewski is a pluralist. Now, that's a good thing these days. A former CEO of a large organization, he has many roles these days in London and in the global specialty insurance marketplace. He also today is part of the CII group attending this event. Now, he was most recently leader of Pro Global and involved in its transition from owned entity to independent. Now, his doctorate also gives us a physics end because it's in nuclear engineering, fusion being his main event, and I'm sure that will feature in our conversation. He also has a master's in public policy from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and another from Warsaw University of Technology. He's a member of our Chartered Body Alliance partner at CII, as I mentioned, and like some others on this gathering, he is a freeman of the City of London. Caroline Saul is a lawyer and partner in project finance at Osborne Clarke, having read law and French, Caroline, I noticed from your CV, at Reading and University Paris-Nanterre. Now, pardon me, my French is just as bad as my English, but never mind. She spent time in Australia at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal in Sydney, seconded to Westpac, the banking organisation that some of our members work with, and seconded to Barclays Capital whilst at Clifford Chance. So 2 physics people, 1 in insurance, 1 in risk, and a lawyer. What could possibly go wrong? Welcome to all of you, indeed. Thank you. Now, the question, will the energy transition now stall as the global economy stalls? That's a question that we think over and above our question, which is about speeding up the transition. Is it now redundant? Or is it a product of bad planning 10 years ago that we're now reaping the harvest of? Now, I'll turn to each of our panelists in turn for a position statement of how they see the state we're in, and we'll get going quickly. So Catherine, first of all, with you, I was struck by some of the comments you've made in the past about the cataclysmic challenges and errors that perhaps have been made leading us to this point, and that this is not just a gas crisis, it could also be an electricity crisis for reasons that you may want to elaborate upon. Is that something you would like to comment on at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes to the question you just asked about whether the transition will stall as the economy stalls. I think we're already seeing the transition stalling, but it's not to do with the economy so much as to do with the second energy crisis that we're currently experiencing. So everybody's very aware of the gas crisis, but hidden underneath that, we now have an electricity crisis that's been building for years. And it's really a result of 2 decades of unrealistic and over-optimistic transition policies. So what we're seeing now is a real threat to security of electricity supplies. In Britain this winter, many clients within the industrial and commercial sector expect they will be rationed this winter, particularly when it's not windy. Low wind is also threatening Germany, Denmark, other countries. We're also seeing low hydro conditions in the Nordics, in Iberia, also in France and parts of Central Europe. Low nuclear output in France as well. And there's a growing realization that we can't import our way out of trouble. Historically, there's been some expectation that it will always be windy somewhere and therefore we can just import that surplus wind. But we've noticed now in recent years that actually low wind conditions can extend over quite wide areas. Last year in September, we had 3 weeks of low wind output across the whole of Northern Europe. And the bulk storage technologies that can smooth this out do not currently exist. There is not a technology that exists today that can manage this situation in Britain. So, the answer to the question really is we have to have a different track. We need to build our energy policy based on things that are real, things that exist today. By all means, have plans for innovation in the future, but today we have a threat to security of supply that has to be addressed. And we've seen already actions from the British government and National Grid that go counter to the decarbonisation narrative in securing deals above market to retain coal generation on the system this winter. There's been similar decisions elsewhere in Europe. We need more of this. We probably need to bring more oil-fired generation back into the system in Britain. Energy security is very important. If lives are lost through climate change, lives are also lost if there's energy insecurity. And when people make an argument that we need to address the energy crisis through more renewables, this is not the correct answer. Our vulnerability in electricity is when it's not windy, and more wind farms do not solve that problem. So my opinion is that we actually need to slow the development of renewable generation and spend those scarce financial resources on addressing heat losses, while the innovation in the storage space catches up so that we can properly maintain security of supply.
So, Catherine, that throws up a lot of points that we'll come on to and sets the scene for the here and now, as opposed to the bright future beyond the next decade or more, and kind of suggests that poor planning in the past leads to the harsh reality that is being faced not just in the UK, but across Europe too. Caroline, from your perspective, when you're advising clients, as you do, what's your view of the current status right now? What is keeping them awake?
So my view of the current status is that I completely agree with Catherine that energy security in the immediate future is important. We still, however, have the goal of, the net zero goal, the goal to decarbonize as well. And what we're seeing is our clients are still very interested and very active in the sector of investing and funding new technologies, looking at the raft of ones available. So we've obviously always had the solar, the wind, etc., onshore, offshore, but also looking at hydrogen. I mean, if we look back at Mark Carney's speech back at COP26 around the necessity of private finance to implement all of these technologies to reach our net zero goal. That's what we are seeing with our clients. They are unlocking new financing structures. They are constantly educating themselves on what they should be investing in, what they need to be investing in, where the market is going as well. What we have seen is regulation struggling to keep up. We don't have the incentives there. We don't have the subsidies there that have necessarily driven investment previously, but we're still seeing the private finance market driving the way forwards. Some certain organizations leading the way. We have got a number of issues to address, but there is a lot of activity still going on the long-term transition.
So I'll come back to you on the net zero goal, and has it been blown out of the water? Really, is a point that we'll come back to on the back of the harsh reality of where we are. Arthur, I know that I'm not going to take anything on with you around your expertise in fusion, because that's very different from today's nuclear, as we know. But from where you sit, what's your observation of the marketplace today?
Sorry, on mute. Thank you very much, Bill. First of all, I will express my own views, but happy also later on to discuss the views prevailing in the insurance industry and also those of the CII. I'm wearing two hats today, so I'm, as you mentioned, nuclear engineer, studying both the traditional nuclear fission as well as fusion, which I devoted early part of my career. And I'm also, my current profession is that of an insurer. So of course, we're engaged in ensuring safe energy production and energy generation. I will make two comments, one short term, one long term. So in the short term, I would agree with what Catherine said. Catherine, you talk about energy security. I would use the term not speeding up energy transition, but making energy transition fair for everyone. And what we observe, so the real threat, and we'll be talking about UK, but it could be translated to other countries. The definition of energy poverty is if 10% disposable income, more than 10% disposable income, is used on essentially paying for your electricity and heating. And median income is 30,000, 10% implies 3,000. Before the energy cap introduced by the current government, there was a specter of 3,500 being spent by average household of energy, rising to 7,000 pounds per annum. So that would mean that half of UK population would face energy poverty, rising to 3/4 of the UK population enduring energy poverty. That would mean riots on the streets, right? So I go back to what Catherine said, poor planning, not really understanding the consequences, resulting in a current situation that not only UK, but other countries are in. So I would advocate for fair energy transition, and fair for all, meaning, you really, the access to energy and ability to heat your home, stay warm, be able to avoid life necessities, a basic human right. Okay. So that's sort of the short-term outlook. In the long term, I shall declare my colors. The answer is fusion, and there's an argument.
How long is the long term, though, just so we can understand?
Yes, of course. So there's a standing joke that the fusion, so I worked on fusion 30 years ago. The standing joke is always 30 years away, right? And it started in 1950s when the scientists said it's possible. But I would counter that with the progress being driven by the governments versus private enterprise. And I'll cite the recent numbers. So the largest government-funded project is ITER, built in Cadarache, southern France. It's 10 times over budget, 60 billion euros or dollars. It's about the same these days. However,
yes.
However, as of late, there actually has been entry of private enterprise. And my former colleagues from MIT have there's about 50 startups. The one that is best funded is Commonwealth Fusion Systems in Massachusetts, just outside Boston, is funded to the tune of 2 billion. And if you extrapolate the current progress, they will achieve the same result as the government is achieving for 60 billion. They will achieve for 6. Okay. And you don't need to look very far, but you look to the space launches. The NASA space launch system is $2 billion. SpaceX is 20 million. Okay, so and that compares to 130 billion of pounds being committed by the government to fund the price cap. So my argument is that fusion progress is not hampered by lack of understanding science and engineering. That is actually the hard part, but actually by the willingness to invest and unleashing the power of competition in private enterprise. So yes, the standing joke is 30 years, but with private enterprise, I believe that will be much shorter.
So I should then, for future members of our Chartered Body Alliance, pencil in a similar chat in 2051, God willing, and we can then return to the subject there.
Question.
Catherine, on that, can you paint for the audience the downside picture that you might see this winter? Because I'm going to corral the here and now. We are where we are before we move on to the future. And I suspect, as it is today, it's a very calm day today. So I had a look on GridWatch earlier, and wind is relatively poor for the UK today. Good old nuclear and gas are picking up the heavy lifting and all that stuff. I suppose a really harsh winter and no wind would be a problem, Catherine. Is that the scenario that you would dread and we should dread?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, wind isn't too bad today. It's this week has been better than it has been for a while. And actually no coal on the system today, which has been unusual. Coal has been running pretty solidly since the spring. We had 3 capacity market notices in July and August, and these are warnings from National Grid that were within 500 megawatts of not being able to meet demand. And those are warning signs of obviously tightness in the market. Now, in winter, our demand is generally 20 gigawatts higher than this is in the summer. Now, in the summer, you also have a lot of plants off on maintenance, and there were about 12.5 gigawatts off on maintenance when those capacity market notices were issued. So we can see that if we had low wind conditions in the winter that were similar to the ones that we had in the summer, we could potentially have quite a significant struggle to meet demand. Now, the models that National Grid uses assumes that we'll be able to import on the interconnectors. This is an untested assumption, and the interconnector participation within the capacity market only requires the interconnectors to be available. It doesn't require them to be importing. So, of course, you have the scenario possible that they're actually exporting at a time of system stress. And given the situation in France, we've been consistently exporting since April, when they discovered this systemic problem with 2 of their different classes of reactors. Norway is the other market which traditionally exports. But Norway has been having an extremely dry year, and since it opened its interconnectors with us and Germany last year, its reservoir levels in the south of the country, which is where these interconnectors land, have fallen to lows not seen since the mid-1990s. And prices in that region of Norway have gone up by a factor of 10 in the last year. The Norwegian government expects to subsidise consumers to up to 90% of their energy bills this winter. And this has become very politically sensitive. The Norwegian Parliament was recalled from its summer recess last week to debate, among other things, the possibility,
which the Norwegians do not do lightly, do they?
Indeed, and so the prospect is that they would make a political decision to restrict exports until our hydro levels recover. And so obviously this now creates quite a challenging scenario for Britain in the winter. If we have low wind conditions and we're not able to import, then we effectively have no capacity and no spare capacity at all, which is why we've seen these deals to keep these coal plants from closing this winter. But it might not be enough. And as I said earlier, industrial consumers definitely expect to be curtailed this winter. And we might see the sort of public appeals that have been in some of the American markets, where the public's being requested to shift its load, to do your laundry at a different time of the day, turn off your heating for an hour, have your dinner earlier or later to avoid the evening peak. If we have low wind conditions in the winter, then it's entirely possible that we'd see something like that happening this year.
Are you surprised, though, that the UK government hasn't moved to make those kind of appeals and start educating the population early, or is that just endemic of the lack of planning?
I think it's a mixture. I think the government's been very focused on the gas situation, and I suspect in some ways lacks the expertise to really dig into this. I also think that there's a fear both within the government and within National Grid ESO around not panicking the market. Unfortunately, when ESO put out its early winter outlook, there wasn't a single person within the market that believed it. Nobody thought it was a credible piece of work. And so, in fact, that actually has the opposite effect, because then you have people like me going out in the media and saying, this isn't true, there's a big risk of security of supply, somebody needs to do something about it. And then risks of blackouts turns up in all the newspapers. So I think there needs to be a much more calm and sensible approach to this, and people need to understand that that might happen.
And I'm sure you attend occasionally the weekly calls that the providers all tune into and listen to the marketplace. And last week there was an administrative mess up where they said that journalists and commentators wouldn't be allowed to attend, and then they revised the position. So it does strike me that there is a less than slick operation there, and I do fear for it. So you described the political challenge of Norway. Does that mean to some extent we may not be in the position to help our French friends out over the course of the winter, because needs must will be back in the UK?
Well, the idea of system stress at both ends of an interconnector is not something that's ever been tested. And so the theory of it is that power will flow to the country with the, from the low price market to the high price market. And if your interconnector is the marginal source of generation, then your prices can, effectively carry on going forever. Now, my personal belief is that it's not in anybody's best interest for that to happen. There are arrangements for the transmission system operators in the two countries to trade between each other, and I would expect that they would act at that point to avoid their getting into a bidding war for transmission capacity. So in that case, quite possibly, the interconnector wouldn't flow in either direction. Each market would try and take care of its own needs if we had simultaneous system stress. But these things are all untested, so it's all a case of wait and see. And we don't know, because it hasn't been made public, whether there are discussions happening at the political level. And for example, this could be happening with Norway. I'm not sure it is. But if I were in Bays, I would be talking to the Norwegian authorities saying, well, how about if we run out of merit generation now? I would have done it earlier in the year in order to preserve Norwegian hydro resources. And in exchange, they would guarantee to export to us if we had a system stress event. So these are interventions in the normal operation in the market. They're political decisions that need to be made, but I think they're decisions that do need to be made. I think it's something we should be looking at.
Yeah, those are interventions that market-savvy individuals would consider to be the norm, as in just part of doing it. My fear is that competence within the political realm from time to time gets lost and washed away. So sometimes it doesn't help. I wonder, Caroline, the fact that your clients are continuing to march and fight and deal with legislation around ESG and everything else. Is there a danger, as you see it, that they are fighting an old war that's now no longer relevant or not present today, or perhaps less important today than dealing with the here and now? Is it simply because they have to, or is it, do you sense there's a general direction of travel to make good?
I think there's a general direction of travel. I mean, we've worked with funds and banks that have had a renewable, sustainable energy focus for a long time. So of course they're ahead of the game, but we're seeing a lot of new entrants to the market, or those who we've been working with who are turning their attention to the more sort of low carbon decarbonisation projects and technologies. I don't think that this is just a here and now issue. I do appreciate, as I said before, that there is an issue with energy security this winter. However, that you can't then ignore what's coming in the long term. I completely agree with Arta's statement that this needs to be a just transition and fair for all. And you've just mentioned ESG, so that's what we've seen over the past few years. We've obviously seen lots of people, lots of clients, lots of entities get more involved and interested in the whole decarbonisation element of things, but also ESG as a driver. There's a huge number of stakeholders for any entity to consider how they can hold themselves accountable to those stakeholders. So it's not just shareholders anymore, it's employees, general reputation in the market, to be seen to be doing the right thing. And therefore that's where the driver comes from as well. So whether it's been people that have been acting, funds, banks that have been acting in this area for a number of years because that's morally where they wanted to be, or people that are now addressing it because that's where they see the future, then there's going to be at some point it's going to have to be that direction of travel. We haven't got the regulation backing that up at the moment, but I think from our perspective that's where they're going. I can't see that they're fighting an old war. As I said, there's new technology coming out all the time. What worked or didn't work 20 years ago, some of it might be relevant, some of it might be revamped now, but there's a huge raft of things for people to go at, to look at, to invest in. Let's not pretend that this is completely altruistic. They're out to make money, and therefore they will be research, and they'll be pursuing opportunities that are financially viable. But as long as they are, then they'll be going for that. So I don't see this as an old war at all. This is people who are engaged, who are committed, who are enthusiastic to pursue these new technologies to achieve this decarbonisation.
Yeah, and I suppose when you look across to the US, and without getting into the politics of it, the statements from the governor in Florida and Texas around ESG, and the sort of the don't think about that for here. Do clients pay attention to that immediately, or do they simply see that as political intervention, or what's your view of that? Again, without straying into the red states, blue states, etc. It's just quite an interesting move.
Sure. I mean, there are two ways to look at it. I mean, if you look at it from what people are saying now, do I want to be any part of a state that is making those statements? Because we know it's not just about power, we know it's about, about energy, it's also about how they treat their population as well, from the sense of the rights that they're restricting. We can also look at it from a perspective here and looking at the technologies that we can lump into what is green. It's a case of, well, do we want to be black and white about things, or do we want to help those states achieve what they need to achieve and go in there and try and change things? And it's the same here. Do we want to be saying, okay, gas is absolutely bad, off the books completely, or do we say, okay, well, actually, in order to get to this green future that we're all heading towards, we need that to aid the transition? So sort of blacklisting Florida and Texas might be in some entities' books because of what they're doing now, but there's also that possibility to go in and try and change things for the good.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder though, would anyone have said 5 years ago that Germany particularly, its highest internet searches over a weekend would be for log burners and burning wood, and we would be turning coal back on again in the spring for the UK? It's quite a remarkable position. Or is it? There's the question. Arta, turning to you, bringing your practicality of both understanding the energy market, but the insurance side of it. As an insurer, what are the fears and concerns about the insurance market looking into what's going on right now as we roll forward over the course of the next year or so?
So as an insurer, right, of course, you know, the energy is a massive sector. The energy generation, the power generation, the extraction, etc. Conversion is something that we play a vital role in. I would like to refer the viewers. There was a very good report issued by Lloyd's of London. I mean, there were a number of statements by other organizations, but actually the one by Lloyd's of London called Ensuring a Sustainable Greener Future is a good report, because essentially talks about the risks and how to de-risk the new sources of energy, and actually talks about nuclear. But there's been, let me put it this way, but some of the climate activists, and you're probably aware there were protests outside of Lloyd's to say you mustn't insure, you know, fossil fuel or hydrocarbon power generation. That's bonkers. That's absolutely bonkers. Would you rather, our job as insurers is to ensure that the power generation energy is safe and accident-free, right? And if something should happen, we're there to stand by to rectify and pay compensation and help restore the original state. So what would you rather have? Would you rather have unsafe hydrocarbon generation, or would you rather have a safe hydrocarbon generation if you know that it is that is a must-have? So what we try to do as insurers, we try to make sure that where we called upon, and whether it's the traditional power, we provide insurance and risk management services and make sure that the accidents are minimized and this generation is safe and effective. And likewise, collectively, we work on what are the risks and needs of new sources of energy, and therefore what are the risks and how should we mitigate those risks and insure those risks. So the notion that somehow we shouldn't be insuring hydrocarbon power generation is just absolutely something I disagree with. Our duty here is to make sure that all power generation and provision of electricity, heat, etc., is safe and accident-free.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine, you mentioned in passing earlier about the prevention of wasted power, wasted energy. So the UK, we have a particular problem, I suspect you're hinting at. You're not necessarily hinting. Tell us more about that.
Well, we have incredibly leaky housing stock in Britain. I think that's pretty well understood. We don't seem to have any sort of a strategy to deal with it. And we need to get one. I mean, fundamentally, that it's a really important thing for us to do. And particularly when we're starting to have these issues with integrating renewables into the grid. We're having a lot of renewable generation being curtailed because we can't move it to where it needs to be. We're struggling to manage the intermittency. It strikes me as an opportunity to pause on the rollout of more renewables, given that we don't have money to do everything at once. I mean, I think we're living in a world of constrained funding. So instead, to devote those resources for a period of time to reducing heat losses, I mean, that's for me a win-win, because it's fully aligned with climate objectives. And also it doesn't have these unintended consequences, if you like, that you get if you're really pushing out one particular technology that creates challenges on the system. I think it's a very difficult problem, which is why it hasn't been tackled. And I think one of the fundamental issues, we have to reform the energy performance certificate. There's a huge misconception that this measures energy efficiency. It does absolutely no such thing. It's explicitly a cost measure. It doesn't actually measure heat losses. It's a purely theoretical and abstract construct, and it completely ignores the condition and quality of materials. So if your windows are completely smashed up, it actually has no impact on your EPC whatsoever, which is just, you know, it makes no sense. You know,
I think the word bonkers, Arthur,
repairs.
is used. Yeah, the word bonkers has been used. So I think that might be appropriate. It would be great. So we have a leaky bucket.
Apologies, technical term.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that's the jargon for this.
I thought bonkers was something in the insurance market that as a banker I'd never heard of, but there we are. So the leaky bucket, Catherine, the point being there's no point filling the leaky bucket until you sort the leak. And the UK has a significant problem with waste of energy. Also, I mean, constraint payments are significant in the UK, and that's for power that's generated that can't be distributed, and the compensation is then paid to the producer, let's say. At what point do you think that the general public market will cotton on to the amount of money being paid in constraint payments?
I'm not sure. I mean, on the one hand, you've got people pushing this narrative that renewables are ever cheaper, and that the cheapest source of energy. I think we had Ed Miliband repeating that this week. It just isn't true. You know, in terms of the cost of the consumer, renewables are not the cheapest form of energy. And that's what we should care about. We should care about the cost to the consumer and not some other thing. So when you look at renewables, obviously they have a low short-run marginal cost. But the consumer pays a subsidy for the renewables to be built. The consumer then has to pay large amounts of network costs for those renewables to be connected. The consumer has to pay for an entirely different set of subsidies that provide the capacity that backs up when it's not windy. So pretty much every form of generation now is entitled to some form of a subsidy, or has been during its life. Then you have balancing costs have gone through the roof because of managing the very sort of short time frame intermittency from renewables. And then you have this issue of curtailment, because you can't move, we don't have enough transmission capacity to move the energy from where it's generated to where it's needed. And so in fact, consumers are effectively paying 3 times for the same capacity. They subsidize the renewables, they subsidize the thermal backup, and then they pay the constraint costs when the renewables have to be curtailed off. And all of these costs have been hidden. They've just this abstract green levies thing that's in bills. And if you plot, as I've done, and you can see this on one of my blogs, a chart of end user electricity prices for the last couple of decades and wholesale electricity prices, you will notice very quickly that there's absolutely no correlation between these two trends whatsoever. End user costs have just gone up and gone up and gone up, and wholesale prices have just done some completely different thing. They've gone down, sometimes they've gone up. Obviously, recently they've gone up a lot. But you know, consumers have been paying that whole cost, and they're being deceived effectively by people sort of pushing this renewables are cheap narrative when it's just not true.
And beyond that, we're not going to get into it today, but the sourcing of the raw materials for the creation of the equipment, the redundancy of the equipment and what's done with it when it's end of life, and then you know the whole lithium thing around batteries is additional cost and impact on the calculation, which I suppose is not even in the margin of the calculation. It's not even on the same book of the calculation. It's somewhere else. Is that something you think we have to have wholesale education on?
It is, and I think, you know, I'm starting to see some signs of this when we're having the ESG discussion. I think up until now, it's been pretty one-dimensional around carbon reduction. And then you've seen some really good projects being turned down because, oh, we don't want to invest in fossil fuels. And so the things I might have in mind here are rural African communities that use solid fuels for cooking, and particularly dried dung, which, you know, is a very pleasant notion. And yet people being unable to get funding to replace that with LPG. LPG is massively cleaner, but then some smug financier sitting in some office somewhere going, oh no, we don't do fossil fuels. And so that leaves these people with a significantly worse you know, situation than they could have. So, and as you mentioned, the whole supply chain around lithium-ion batteries, you know, you have significant issues with the use of child labour, pollution of water sources. I'm not really persuaded that clean air is better than clean water, or that we should have dirty water as a price we pay for clean air. And then issues with things like forced labour in the solar panel supply chains. And I think people are starting to get more aware of these issues, that it's not just a one-dimensional carbon reduction plan that we need, as Arthur said earlier, to have a fair and just transition. And that's not just in terms of the cost that the consumer's paying, but it needs to be fair for all sections of society.
Yes, so Arthur, I'll come to you in a moment, but Caroline, is that something you feel that your clients recognise, or are they simply delivering what they have to deliver to their stakeholders, shareholders and owners? Or are the things that we've just talked about with Catherine at the margins, are they front and centre really or not?
So there's what's happened over the last sort of few years is certainly an acknowledgement, as Catherine was saying, around the life cycle of the technologies that are being used. I think Arthur and I have had a conversation before, and sort of acknowledging that the construction of, or the manufacturing of solar panels, the construction of wind farms, obviously all produce their own carbon footprint. It's then going on looking at the life cycle and sort of saying, okay, well, over the life of that project, is that lower carbon than a coal-fired power station? Yes, it will be. Is it perfect? It's not, and that's recognised, as you're saying. I think about the recycling of batteries as well. This is always an issue that we have to look at. So no, it's not a case of, oh, we'll just go at it and we'll pretend everything's fine and we'll ignore the whole process of it. But it is a case of, okay, but in the grand scheme of things, looking at ESG as a whole, what's the best option? Not taking into account or at all saying that child labour is a good option, but that would be a case of saying, okay, well, let's look at that. That's not acceptable. Okay, well, can we then pay more to get it done ethically? I did want to, if it's okay, go back to what Catherine was saying about energy efficiency around tackling that issue, because I agree that the built environment is leaky and certainly needs to be addressed from a sort of energy security, energy efficiency point of view. I know that you, the Chartered Bank Institute, work alongside the Green Finance Institute to educate people into how to invest in technologies, and on what the Green Finance Institute are also doing are setting up demonstration projects. They're going out doing research to try and make the energy efficiency measures in residential homes financeable for everyday homeowners. They don't have to fork out this huge upfront cost. So that work is being done. I mean, should we have done it, would it be ideal to do it 10, 15 years ago? Yes, of course, but those steps are being taken, because, as Catherine was saying, it's a huge, so far unaddressed issue, and if it's resolved, it would make a huge impact on our use of energy, and that is being done by them. And they, I think a couple of weeks ago, released a study around property-linked finance as well, so that is ongoing.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, would you heat your own personal home and leave the windows open? Is the sort of the obvious question. Arthur, you were keen to make a point. I think you also, I guess, would touch on the real challenge around concrete in construction.
I wasn't about to say, I'm not a construction specialist, but I wanted to support Catherine, what you said earlier, which is it's a very one-dimensional measure. It's, if I drive an electric car, I'm zero emission. That's just the biggest heresy. Yeah, that's the biggest heresy. The biggest heresy ever existed, right? So when I was at MIT, we always did a total energy balance of whatever the energy source or whatever human activity was. And it starts with, of course, the mining, the production, the concrete that you need to use, then therefore the energy return through the life cycle of this given energy source, and then the commissioning and disposal and recycling of waste. And this is not only about the CO2, but it's a total environmental impact, right? So what if you reduce the CO2 emission, if over here, you create an environmental catastrophe? I've actually, to support what Catherine, you were saying, I've actually looked up some facts. So lithium is leached through an acid or alkaline process, and 1 ton of lithium requires 1 million liters of water to produce. And there are communities in South America where essentially they face shortages of water because of lithium production. The second most important ingredient is cobalt. Without cobalt, we wouldn't have batteries. And cobalt, 70% of world cobalt comes from Democratic Republic of Congo, essentially, and most of it is owned by Chinese companies. There's about 250,000 people employed in mining cobalt, of which 20%, 40,000 are children. Okay, yeah. So these are facts, and this comes from Wilson Institute, which is an American institute for policy studies. So I think in this narrative of trying to be more virtuous than my neighbor, we lose sight of what's really happening, what's the total energy footprint, and what's the total environmental impact of energies that we are promoting. And that should be our duty, is to look at the total impact rather than this, I'll use the term virtue signaling, if I may.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions coming in, and there is a banking dimension. So as non-bankers, I'm keen to ask your view, because you all use banking services. Given the ineffectiveness of housing in the UK that you've mentioned, Catherine, should it be beholden on the lenders with mortgage provision to insist as part of the mortgage provision that should be remedially corrected? Do you think that would be an incentive, stick, carrot, whatever you want, that the legislatively that could be made work? What do you think?
Well, I'm instinctively nervous about this, partly because I think the EPC is such a terrible measure. And it doesn't provide the right incentives to do the right things. And so I think there's been a tendency, both on the policy side and also on the finance side, to look at that as the only available tool, and therefore to use that as the metric. But of course, because it doesn't do a very good job and doesn't measure efficiency at all, and nobody's actually measuring heat losses. I mean, for me, that's the first step, is to actually go and measure heat losses. So I don't think, and I'm a former banker, so I'm not having, I'm not trying to do down what the industry can provide, but I think the first step really has to be a policy step by government, and government needs to mandate a proper measurement programme, and then there needs to be an alignment of the houses that are measured to have the highest heat losses. And thermal imaging can be done remotely, as in you don't need to actually physically access the property and go on the property to do it. You can be done from the street, for example, so you don't necessarily need the householders' cooperation to do that. And then to cross-reference that with the with low-income households and target those for the work first. And I'm not sure that that low-income households are really at the front of the queue for green finance. Maybe the landlords might be, but the households themselves probably aren't. So I see this more as something that should be driven by government and policy in the first instance.
Thank you. So Arthur, there is another question that's coming in, and it's one of the big questions that we don't have an answer to, but I'm going to push you anyway. The war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has that precipitated the need for this whole subject matter to be considered to be almost impossible to deliver?
No, I don't think the war in Ukraine, and this is a personal view, if I may, the war in Ukraine suddenly changes things. It's simply shown the weakness of the system and of planning. There was a very interesting article in The Economist about the German economy for a change, where, as you know, the sort of there was a lot of coal plants offline, nuclear energy offline, because the gas from Russia will flow, and there are bilateral agreements between Russia and Germany, and hence the construction of a Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I remind the viewers, it was a political statement. It was a bilateral between Russia and Germany, and it bypassed Ukraine, Poland, my home country, and all the other country, because there was a belief that will give Germany the sort of energy security on energy source, right? What transpired, right? Nord Stream 2 not online, and Nord Stream 1 switched off by Russia recently for indefinite future. So these are the events that precipitated, but what essentially they demonstrate lack of forward thinking and long-term planning, and actually understanding the geopolitical risks and the geopolitical reality.
Yeah, and I think, Catherine, you touched on it earlier, that a crisis in gas, a crisis in electricity, and the European dimension is a collision of events, but a lot of it self-created. Caroline, one for you. What is the thought process in legal circles around greenwashing that's much talked about, but very rarely fully explained?
I mean, the greenwashing comes from the reputational sort of risk, etc., that I was talking about earlier. Yeah. Everyone wants to be seen to be doing the right thing. I mean, considering the headlines we've seen recently about companies being held to account for greenwashing, then again, it's something that is very much at the forefront of the minds of the people that we work with. They do not want to be seen to be doing that. They want to be, they want to do the right thing, but they don't want to be seen to, they don't want to be shouting about something that they've done and crossing lines, giving a false impression at all. So greenwashing is an absolute no-go. That they want to be able to stand by what they've said.
Yeah, and the audience we've got, boy, they are really a great audience, and the questions are coming in, quite detailed questions, and we are getting towards the end of our time. I mean, there is one question that's probably a yes or no answer for all three of you. Do we believe that the US will reach its net zero by 2050? Don't all rush.
I think the question is whether UK will hit 2050.
I think also I'm interested in both the UK and the US. Do we think it will happen?
I'll start. I'm brave enough to start. And in a sense, I had given my answer, fusion. And it is 2050. Yes. You said it yourself, Bill. It is
2051 for the next review. I think interestingly, UK actually is one of the leader in fusion. The Joint European Torus, which is housed in Culham, just outside Oxford, and is perhaps the most advanced scientific instrument, and it is on the UK soil. And as you've heard, the government actually supports the direction of travel. I repeat what I said earlier. It's actually interesting. I'll come back to Catherine's point. Catherine, you mentioned there's been renewables had tremendous amount of subsidies of essentially taxpayer money so that they came online, and that happens in other countries, particularly in Germany. It's been funded by tax. If there was at least a fraction of that directed towards fusion, the progress would have been faster. The progress is really hampered by lack of investment and, as I said earlier, lack of competition. So to hit net zero 2050, the answer is fusion, but it is my personal view. Thank you. Catherine, a yes or no would suffice.
No.
Thank you. Caroline, your view.
I will go with optimism, and I will say yes, because the number of new technologies coming to the fore in the past decade are not what we expected, and therefore we don't know what's going to happen in the next decade. So I say it's something we have to aim for, and I will be optimistic and say yes.
An optimistic lawyer, goodness me, I'm writing it down. Thank you. David Williams, thanks very much indeed for your question. This is about energy poverty for the lowest earners in countries. The suggestion, David, is what if someone is in a relatively larger property and can't afford to heat it? Do they have the same poverty as anyone else? So asset rich, cash poor. The demographic time bomb in the UK with the baby boomers now in their 70s and beyond, you're probably right, is the point. We are coming to the last minutes of this podcast. It's been fascinating. I'd love to go on, and we may think about a second go if everyone can be bothered doing it in the future. That'll be one for the Institute to deal with, because this subject is alive and living amongst us right now. This is not some notional should we, could we, will we. This is for real. So as we draw the threads of our conversation together, I wonder what closing thoughts our panelists will share. Caroline, what will your takeaways from this section be?
Might, I mean, it's really interesting to listen to Arthur and Catherine point out the flaws, really, the faults with the decarbonisation, the transition, because the work that I do, we're very much filled with the optimism, the drive forward. I think it will be a case of we really need to address all the issues. We need to make sure that we're approaching this in a holistic manner, and we need to not just go forward with the hope that it will all be fine, and address all of the issues that people are genuinely concerned about.
Thank you. I know there's another question about China, but we'll deal with that another day. I was at a GEFI conference recently where someone from Africa was suggesting that instead of looking at northern and southern hemisphere, we should think about the world being east-west as well, and as well as north-south, for a whole reason of practical reasons. Arthur, any closing comments from you, wearing either of your two hats? I'm relaxed about which one you're wearing.
I'll probably produce an exhibit, and we'll see if it shows. Oops, no, it doesn't show.
It makes you invisible. That's fantastic. There we go. We can see it now.
Yeah. I wish we would not have to see the headlines like that in the press. Again, yeah. I don't think, 21st century, advanced economy, question on the sort of Money Week, which I hate to read, we should not be facing these questions. And I think that's a fundamental flaw of our planning policy and at end. So I repeat what I said very early on at the very opening statement. It is all about a fair energy transition, not doing it at all costs and speeding up.
So Catherine, as a pragmatist and someone who's operating in this market, advising clients on the here and now and the reality, what are your closing thoughts for us?
That we need to remember that the energy trilemma is important, and that all aspects of it we've basically forgotten about.
So remind us what that trilemma is. That's quite a nice phrase.
Well, decarbonisation, obviously, and that's what's had all the attention up until now, but security of supply and affordability are both really important and can't be ignored. And arguably they have been up until very recently. The other takeaway that I have is that we need to have, I think, a wider understanding of sustainability, that it's not just about carbon reduction, it's about being genuinely sustainable, reducing waste, and avoiding all types of harms, not just the carbon harm.
Thank you all. Well, as we reach the end of our time together, it's been the fastest hour of the week for me so far, but that's merely a reflection on the kind of weeks that I have during the course of the day. All that remains is for me to thank our panelists for their considered input and time today, which we are truly grateful for. So thank you all three of you. If we could, we would shake hands and give a round of applause, but given that we can't, it will have to be in the memory and virtually. To you, our audience, live or on catch up, thank you for watching. And to the team at the Chartered Banker Institute who make it all happen, and they make my job a breeze. To Matthew Ball, thank you. And a special thanks today to Emma O'Sullivan, for whom this will be almost her last event for the Institute before moving on to pastures new. So Emma, from all of us, thank you very much indeed. If you're one of our Chartered Body Alliance friends, we've been delighted to host you and see you today. So to CISI and CII, thank you. You're very welcome, and haste you back, as they say in Scotland. So for me, Bill McCall, and all of us at the Chartered Banker Institute, thank you for watching, and I do look forward to next time.